They say having a bad plan is better than having no plan at all. But isn't it better just to have a good plan put in place in the beginning? Here we see Sergei Karjakin use that to great effect in his game against Petr Kiriakov in the Canarias blitz playoff in May 2004. Here in this position we reach a queenless middle game after just 15 moves. The position seems roughly equal, but Karjakin has noticed a few characteristics about the position. Firstly, he has an excellent knight on d4. This blockades black's d-pawn from moving anywhere, and black is now saddled with this so-called bad French bishop. Now clearly black is okay though, he's very solid, but which side of the board should white play on? Should white play on the queen side, in the centre, or on the king side? Karjakin decided that his first move, king d2, would allow white to embark on a variety of different strategies. As we can see by all the arrows, white is able to play on the queen side with a4, like this, or he can push with g4 and f5 on the king side or the centre. This was stopped by Kiryakov's next move, h5, and now we see Karjakin's ability to be flexible with all of his plans. He decided, well, if I can't go g4, why don't I just stick to the plan of playing on the other side of the board? He now played b3. So what do we think white is trying to achieve here? As I said, black is very, very solid in this position, and he has a very tough defence to try and break down. And it takes excellent play from Karjakin in order to do that against a strong opponent that he is facing here. Let's see how he does this. So g6 prevents f5, so it's clear what black's strategy is. He's trying to prevent white playing g4 and f5. So Karjakin continue with a4. It's very important also to notice that this pawn b3 idea wasn't just a prelude to try and defend the pawn on a4, but also to prevent any knight invasion on c4. Not that white should be overly worried about that, but white wouldn't really want to swap off this lovely bishop on d3, because the bishop is actually very strong, pointing in different directions, isn't it? So white's trying to keep this slight space advantage that he has due to the pawn on e5. We've come across that many times already in Sergei's games. And he's just basically trying to push on the queen side. It takes excellent skill though in order to achieve a good position from this. So, knight c8 and b4. Here we go. Still, it's pretty okay for black here, but things start to go a little bit south for him. a5. Now this is a critical moment, I believe, because many players would play a certain move now, and it's actually not a mistake per se, but it allows black a position that he wants. Should white push b5? Should white protect the pawn with c3? Or should white play rook to b1? So you have a choice of 3 moves. Rook b1 is the best move here. The reason why is that b5, it gains space, but it now allows black to play the move he wants to play, which is knight b6. And this is a very typical kind of setup. The knight on b6 blockades the pawn on b5 from moving anywhere, and the knight is very good at jumping over to all these excellent squares. In fact, that pawn on a4 will be weak for the rest of the game. White will always have to monitor that pawn. Probably black will consider moves like rook fc8 and trying to invade on c4 at some moment. Probably white has lost some advantage here that he had. So, Karjakin decides to keep the lines open. Now, another thing we notice is this, again, apparent lack of coordination between the rooks. White will now increase the pressure on the b7 square, and in order to do that, he needs to keep this b line open for attack. That is why he did not play b5. Now, the threat is simply just to take on a5 and hammer down on b7 square. So after a takes b4, rook takes b4, rook a7, it still appears that black is doing okay. And he is. Let's see how Karjakin manages to turn the pressure, turn the screw per se on black's position. Now, the king is attempting to run round to c7 to protect. Still, though, the question remains, what on earth is black going to do about the rook on h8? Because if that can't join in the game, then the rook will just be stuck out on the king side and not really doing a lot. Potentially black can consider g5 or f6, but what they might do is just eventually end up weakening his own pawns on e6, h5 and so on. White, on the other hand, I think all of his pieces are in very good squares. The king on d2 stands excellently. It can look in all different directions, so any potential endgame will end up being quite good for white. c4. Now, even though the queens are exchanged, as we said, black's slight lack of coordination with the rooks and the minor pieces means that Karjakin has noticed something very nice here, which is he can actually open up the position to his benefit. So with c4, he immediately threatens to take on d5. If, for example, I play a move like rook e8, and we take on d5, this pawn now on d5 is a huge target. White can consider moves like bishop e2 to f3, or something like bishop c2 to b3, like this. Many other moves, maybe even rerouting the knight on d4 as well. So black doesn't really want to be saddled with that weakness, so he took on c4. And I'm pretty sure he just expected Karjakin just to capture it back. But instead we saw another lovely move, bishop e4. And this little switchback really put the pressure on black now, because that pawn on c4, well, it's not really going anywhere, is it? And the pawn on b7 is now going to come under tremendous pressure. Notice the lack of coordination between black's pieces. Only the black rook and the black king can defend this pawn. On the other hand, 3 white pieces are going to be able to attack it. Let's see how this pans out. So king c7. Now rook b1 is still a good move, but instead Karjakin decided to just capture on c4 first, and then played rook b1. Very smooth play. It just appears again out of nowhere. I feel like I always say these about Karjakin's games. He seems to have a fairly okay position middle game, and suddenly out of nowhere, a great plan appears or a great idea appears. Very smooth chess. He never does anything very unusual. Just very natural moves. Rook b1, bishop e4, attacking this pawn on b7, and he does it to great effect. So after knight e7. a6, and now this is a lovely move, attacking the pawn on b7. Black can hardly consider rook takes b7, because rook takes a6 because of b7, and now black is completely lost. So, a6, rook c8, rook b4, really keeping the pressure. Again, he noticed that after rook c8, if we capture, bishop takes c8 protects the b7 square. So there's the tactics being involved again. So rook b4, bishop c6, the only try. And now if you can see the winning combination for white, you are an excellent tactician. Otherwise, just sit back and see how black's position is reduced to complete disarray. Let's have a look. Knight takes c6, rook takes b7 check, and now there are a number of moves, but I really like Karjakin's next move, rook b8 check, and that forced resignation, because this bishop on e4 pins the knight, so black would have to take on b8, and now bishop takes c6, and look at that black king hold up in the corner. Black would have to give up a rook, and he will be clearly losing. So there you go. When you have your typical middle game, whether it's with queens on the board or queens are not on the board, as we saw here, it's important to think about what your plan is, which side of the board you're going to play on, but even more so, it's flexibility. Try to imagine if your opponent prevents you from, for example, attacking on the king side, look on the other side of the board. Try to remain flexible with all your plans, and that is the key thing we should take away from this game.